Hello and welcome again to Creative Secrets. This is James Hudnall, and this is about Act 3, final act of a three-part story structure, and ultimately the most important act. Everything that happens before Act 3 is just to prepare for Act 3. What every writer should understand is that an Act 3, or the ending of a story, is the most important part of the story, because that's the last part that people remember when they exit a theater, when they read a book, a comic, whatever it is. The last part of the book, the ending, is what either sticks with them or it doesn't. It either turns them off or it turns them on. You have to have a great ending. So you can have a great story leading up to the third act, but if it's not good, it doesn't matter. People will remember the ending as being either bad or good, and they'll judge the whole story based on that. So you have to make sure that the ending is the best part. Save it for the ending. Now let's talk about the structure. Act 3 is the resolution of the story, which means everything needs to be tied up. All the questions that you open in the story must be tied up by the end. All your threads need to be tied up as well. All the subplots need to have a resolution, unless, of course, this is the first part of an extended series and the first episode of a series. You can have a structure within that multiple arc series, but as a complete story or as the first part of a series, you should have a feeling of the third act structure with a resolution. People do not like things that are not tidied up properly. So this is what you need to do. And that's something that you must consider. Also remember that the story, as I said in other videos, is a question that needs to be answered. It's an argument that needs to be proven. Your heroes or your protagonists are the champions of the story's argument, whatever that may be. And the ending is where the argument is settled in some fashion. So it'll either be settled for the better or for the worse. That's up to you. But your characters are representing one side of an argument and your villains are representing the other side of the argument. And it doesn't matter what you're dealing with in terms of theme or stories ideas. You're going to be playing out what is essentially a conflict, and ideas are going to be addressed in that conflict resolution. So that's one of the things you also need to think about. The ending has a twist of some kind, and that leads to the climax, the final conflict between the hero and the villain, or between the hero and whatever it is their conflict is with. That is going to be the ultimate test, the do or die situation. The lessons that the hero learned in the course of this story should be put into effect and be used to win, unless, of course, you want to go the other way. But this is how you have a satisfying ending, is the hero has failed in the early part of the story, but learned what they needed to know about themselves or about the situation in order to succeed, so you can have a positive ending. And that is something that's very fulfilling. The more you put the character through, the more powerful the ending will be as a resolution. So that is something I will dedicate a whole video to, called Story Values. When I get to that, I'll explain how you can make your story extremely powerful and profound, hopefully. And then you get into the resolution, the denouement, as they say in French, which is where everything tidies up and your character walks away. And how that happens is, again, the nature of your ending will say a lot. It also is very important that questions are answered and fulfilled so the audience doesn't feel cheated. So your character will discover a lot of things. Those lessons will hopefully be carried with them as they walk away at the end. Also, polarity needs to be switched. If a story starts off positive, it needs to be either negative at the end, or it should be a much higher degree of positive or negative at the end. So if the story starts off with a negative scene, it could end up with a positive ending, or it could have a much more negative ending. It's a greater degree of severity. So there's a feeling that there was a net change. It can't have a neutral ending. An ending that is basically neutral and the start was neutral, then it's not satisfying. I mean, you can have a neutral ending, don't get me wrong, but it's just not a satisfying ending. It just usually isn't. So that's something to consider. The fortune switched, meaning that if your character starts off poor and ends up rich, that's a big polarity shift. If they start off rich and end up poor, that's another polarity shift. But it doesn't have to be just fortunes. It could be other kinds of fortunes. Person could be married and end up divorced. Person could be in good health and end up in poor health, or starts off with poor health and ends up with good health. I mean, you can think about all these possible polarities and fortunes being shift. So there's a feeling of something that happened in the story. Now, when I get into story values, I'll explain that you can go through a range of things, both positive and negative, but the ending has to have a feeling of a polarity shift for the story to feel like something happened. I'll get into another video on polarity and everything, but this is just to give you this simple explanation for now. And finally, what is the moral of your story? The point that you're trying to make. It must be explored in the first part of your story. So the first 2 acts need to explore the moral. So the hero represents the moral and the villain represents the antithesis of the moral. So it's thesis versus antithesis. Basically, your hero believes one thing, your villain believes another thing, and they are arguing it out, not like a political argument necessarily, but they are representing a different moral point of view. And if you're trying to establish a strong moral point of view, then you have to prove why the villain is wrong. But you can't do it in such an obvious dumb-headed way as to just make it out that the villain is stupid or he's bad. That's not enough. You have to make the villain believable. I will do a whole video on villains, and we'll get into that there. But you have to understand that the moral, in order to have an effect, can't be a lecture. It can't be preached at us. It has to be proven. You have to convince people, not preach to them. And so your story, if it has a moral, it needs to be proven in the course of the story, throughout the acts of the story, through all of the events of the story should be serving to prove that point. That's something you also need to remember. Okay, that's it for this episode. I will be getting into this stuff in much more detail in following episodes. Please check the links below. Please subscribe to this channel, and I look forward to talking to you again. Happy New Year.